All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, October 12th, 1992, the first three-way TV presidential debate in history took place featuring George H.W. Bush, the Republican incumbent, Bill Clinton, the upstart Democrat who would go on to win, of course, and independent, super upstart Ross Perot. Perot, as he often did, kind of stole the show that night, even though he was really a last-minute addition, and there were lots of questions right up until the last moments about whether he would even run or even participate in the debate. So here to discuss that debate, a little bit on Perot's insurgency, and maybe we will get to that ever-present question, or myth really, of whether Perot actually cost Bush that election and paved the path for Clinton. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia.
Hello, Jody.
Sorry, what did I screw up? What did I say? Hello, Nikki?
You normally introduce
hello,
both
Nikki?
of us.
Yeah, you do both of them.
Oh my God, what is wrong with you?
That's how you do the outro. You say Nikki, and then
it's only like 600 episodes in.
Notice how we all pause like that's right.
Yeah, and listeners are probably like crashing their car into a tree. Or like,
everything's different.
Let me try. Yeah, who moved my cheese? Let me try that again. Here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
All right. So yeah, Nikki, let's start with that. Perot's inclusion here, right? The story of this election feels like Perot was such a deep part of it. Like no one can imagine the 1992 election without Ross Perot. But it was a big open question as to whether he would even be part of the story, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was a pretty unusual independent candidate because he didn't really have a party. He was just an independent candidate, and he had launched his campaign on the Larry King show. And he said that, if my supporters out there can get me on all 50 states ballots, then I'm going to run. And they do that. And so he's technically in the race, and he's going around and he's giving speeches and he's going on television and he's leading in polls against both Bush and Clinton. So he is this force to be reckoned with. And he's some of the air is going out of the balloon by July. But when Bill Clinton accepts the nomination for the Democrats, Ross Perot just pops up and he's like, okay, well, that seems fine. So I'm not going to run. I'm out. And he just leaves the race. And then August happens, September happens. And then at the start of October, he pops back up again. And he's like, actually, I don't feel like the topics that I feel are important or being talked about in the way I want to talk about them. So guess who's back? And then he's back in the race because he'd always been on the ballot, right? So it was just about him deciding whether to be fully present or not.
Right. And that media teasing and knowing you can string people along and then jumping in only when, the odds are starting to move more in your favor and seeing that the election plays out and there may be a lane for you. I mean, obviously there's so many Trump parallels there. There's tons of Trump and Perot parallels. But, the media bought it. I mean, you go back and read, Time Magazine had a huge cover story that was called Waiting for Perot. It's a pretty clever title there. And I actually
pretty good.
I went and researched, by the way, like everyone used Waiting for Perot. The waiting, like the Tampa Bay Times used, the Washington Post uses like 15 different articles that use Waiting for Perot. When you have a good pun, I guess you go
That's
for
right.
it. But yes, he had it both ways. He got to be in the race and also not in the race at the same time until this moment where then, yes, he's in the race and he shows up on the debate stage.
Schrodinger's candidate.
And this is the first time where America has to really take him seriously. He has to answer foreign policy questions and domestic agenda questions and, offer up solutions that are typical in debates and banter back and forth with people that have had political experience. And he doesn't have any of that. He just has money and quippy one-liners.
Well, so that's something I'm curious about as we think about Ross Perot, because the other thing he's famous for is this sort of wonky side, right? He would get these half-hour, he would take out these half-hour infomercials with all these charts, right, and talk about all this, But the stuff that he's also remembered for, and especially at this debate, are these one-liners, as you were saying, Kellie. So I'm curious, Nikki, this is where the Trump comparisons fall apart because Trump doesn't have that wonky side. He only has the one-liners, but Perot had both.
Yeah, he did have them both, and he was very savvy about using television. And, who knows why it worked, but in a pre-538 time, when people wanted to dig into the data, there he was, and people watched it. Tens of millions of people would tune in to these infomercials that he was putting on. So there was something about that combination of wonkiness and folksiness and just the improbability of somebody like Perot, who is this tiny man with these giant ears and this high squeaky voice, that he was the person that was capturing the Americans' imagination.
Yeah.
It all seemed so improbable, but as more and more people got on board and as he was leading in the polls, people were looking around and being like, okay, well, maybe I should start taking him seriously.
Mm-hmm. I think people are always sort of persuaded, or at least maybe, influenced by someone who is speaking out their grievances, or sort of saying both people are messed up, both people are corrupt, both, saying, pointing out the problems, not necessarily offering up solutions, but at least putting their finger on people's frustrations politically with feeling like both parties were inept in terms of getting things done. I think he had a lot of success, and a lot of politicians have success by pointing out, that the establishment poses no real solution, or has no real solution, or has had opportunities and missed those opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this Trump comparison is actually really useful in that sense because it's that anti-establishment thing. Ross Perot is a billionaire a couple of different times over, and pretty successful for building his own computer company. And he is so braggadocious and so narcissistic. I mean, here's somebody who believes because he's a billionaire, he can run the country. But he also he wanted to independently go to Vietnam and rescue the POWs, like a much smaller version of Rambo. And he just had this sense that because he had the money, he should be able to impose his solutions. And, Americans respond very strongly to a person in business with a lot of money running for president.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We think that people who have money have solutions. They must have gotten it somehow. They know.
Right?
Tell us your ways.
And this debate, though, he does, from a pure kind of debate performance, he really does a remarkable job. I mean, he, completely destabilizes Bush and Clinton on stage. He has one of his most famous lines is a sort of response to that. Well, you don't have any experience, and he basically says so you're telling me I haven't bankrupted this country and done a bunch of awful things? Yes, I don't have insider experience. That's the whole point. And then he also has that very famous line about the giant sucking sound, right? When he's making an anti-free trade argument, very resonant of Donald Trump as well. But he says, if George H.W. Bush's economic policies continue, you're going to hear a giant sucking sound of jobs being sucked away from the U.S. into Mexico. I mean, talk about the seeds of what came to sprout in 2016. But I think Perot's role in that election also brings out a couple other interesting themes that maybe we'd forgotten about, which is, yes, like, George H.W. Bush was incredibly unpopular, floundering, sort of like personality-wise, just like really prone to having someone like Ross Perot destabilize him. But I also think it's an interesting reminder that Bill Clinton, people weren't really sure about him either. And we sort of write that story backwards of like, oh, he was this charming kid. He was this new, we've talked about this on this show, he was this charming, young, energetic baby boomer president who was like capturing this new American fervor. And like going jogging and so forth. But I don't think Perot sees this lane unless he also sees that people are a little wary of Clinton too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, voters don't trust Clinton. He's not particularly popular in that sense, and they're worried about all of the baggage he's bringing with him. And even though he presents himself as a new Democrat, they had not voted for a Democratic president for a long time, and they still had a little bit of that Carter reluctance, or that reluctance from the Carter era. So there was a lane. And particularly, I think the NAFTA policy is exactly why there was a lane, because, when the two parties agree on an issue and nobody is voicing the other component of it, there is an opening for a third party or an independent to say, hey, they agree on a bad thing. No one is speaking for you.
Barbara Bush gets on the stage with a red ribbon for AIDS, for victims of AIDS. That's shocking to me.
So it's part of an evolution that's happening in the party, right? Because that's it's 1992. You have Pat Buchanan, who is a pretty anti-gay figure, but you also had Mary Fisher, who was at the 1992 convention talking about her experience with AIDS. And so Barbara Bush is kind of tying into that softer side of the Republican Party.
Got it.
We should mention the debate was in St. Louis. Any other memories from that night? It's not like, I mean, Perot, I think, is the star, but I think Clinton also starts to find his sea legs as well, right, NIki?
Right, because Clinton makes sure that he saves at least some of his fire for George Bush. And George Bush was really struggling because he was trying to figure out how to balance the extremer side of his party. Pat Buchanan, of course, had been a candidate in 92. The convention was a pretty dark, gay bashing, feminist bashing moment. And Clinton uses that against Bush. He points out that Senator Prescott Bush had been out there attacking Joe McCarthy, even when that was politically costly for him back in the 1950s, and using Bush's own history against him, saying that he's not as strong as his father was when it came up to standing against the bad and dangerous elements in his own party. It was a pretty effective line. It was one of those that they were repeating all the next day.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting too when Senator Joe Biden remarking on the election says, you see, this is a two-man race, Governor Clinton and Ross Perot.
Right, which became the conventional wisdom, which is a kind of amazing thing to say when you have an incumbent president also running for re-election. But that, I think, starts to get at, I think, one of the big questions around this election, and one of the big, I would argue, myths about this election, which is, that Ross Perot was a spoiler who took votes from George H.W. Bush, and if it weren't for Ross Perot, George H.W. Bush would have won. So the facts are that Perot ends up getting 19% of the vote, which is the highest share since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. You talk to anyone, I think, to this day in the Bush campaign, and they'll say, oh, it was Ross Perot, he sunk us. But the fact of the matter is, Bush's approval rating was 29%. I mean, he was not popular, and I think that's really important to remember.
He was not a shoo-in.
Right. And also, exit polls, which I think have their usefulness, did show that voters generally would have split evenly between the two. Now, and so I think there was actually a whole documentary that 538 did about this, but that basically said exploded this myth. And if you look at the data and the polling, and I tend to agree with that. That said, I also think just from a narrative perspective, when you have these moments like on this debate stage of a 2-on-1 against the sitting president, I think that that it's silly to then go all the way the other direction and say, well, Perot was basically a non-factor. He clearly hurt Bush and helped wound an already very wounded candidate.
Right. If you're looking just at the polls, it does seem pretty clear that it was a split, because when Perot drops out of the race in July, most of that accrues to Bill Clinton. He comes out of that convention with like a 27-point lead or something like that. And when Perot comes back into the race, it really eats away at that. So I think that's right. I mean, Bush was in a terrible place when he ran for president, and Perot doesn't necessarily take away all of his voters, but reinforces that Bush has a great deal of opposition and there are other options out there.
Which is, I think, also interesting because, what I remember most about Ross Perot was like the SNL spoofs of him that Dana Carey did that were hilarious. But it also just goes to show that even sort of the humor and the characterization of him couldn't really dismantle or didn't take away votes when people went into the ballot booth. So it's interesting how the things that we might dismiss about a political candidate are sometimes the very things that push people toward that candidate.
Yes. Well, and I think another reminder that at some level, I think it's just like fame is fame and attention is attention. And if you're getting parodied, it means that people are at least paying attention to you and sort of like pulling out parts of your personality and finding some sort of level of connection with it. So absolutely. So final thing, as we wrap up, you did mention, NIki, that he is a truly independent candidate at this point in 1992. He doesn't have a party, but then Perot obviously stays on the scene for a long time. He forms the Reform Party, which I will go on to mention that Donald Trump flirted with running for president on the Reform Party ticket, in 2000?
In 2000.
Yeah, so there you go. But he ends up a man with a party eventually.
It's the repository for all presidential candidates who have no political experience.
There you go. All right, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Whose fault is that? Not the Democrats, not the Republicans. Somewhere out there's an extraterrestrial that's doing this to us, I guess. And everybody says they take responsibility. Somebody somewhere has to take responsibility for this.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia. From